All right, welcome back to the discussion on The Shining, the film and the book. And this episode will be episode 2B, I believe, which continues the book discussion. Now, for purposes of the review, I would like to remind you that I'm using the paperback version of The Shining. It's a black and chrome cover with a boy's face that's blank. The reason for that will be made evident eventually if you have not already read the book. I'll give you a little bit of information about the book. It is copyright in 1977 by Mr. Stephen King, Doubleday and Company, Park Avenue, New York. New York. I'll give you all the information there on the screen. This is an authorized reprint of a hardcore edition published by Doubleday. And looks like first Sydney printing January 1978. So basically that's the information for the book. I left off at, I believe it was chapter 3. Now before we actually get started, if you haven't already watched the other episodes, I suggest you do so. We started off with a discussion of the Masque of the Red Death because, of course, Mr. King references a paragraph from The Masque of the Red Death. And through our review of Mr. King and Mr. King's work, which we did in a previous episode, and Edgar Allan Poe and Edgar Allan Poe's work in The Masque, we have a better understanding already of the film The Shining. In my opinion, there are things in there that I did not understand and that are more clear to me now than they were before I started this review. So it's been a little while. I guess I owe an explanation for that, so I'll keep it short and sweet. Basically, my computer died. I lost everything. I had to redo everything. That's the big one. And no, that's not true. That's not the big one. The big one is I was upset that my computer died and I lost everything because that was a lot of information. And I had to, I'm going to have to start over with images and everything. And that was irritating to me. So that was the biggest hang up. And I also had to get new internet service and do a few other things. So I had some music. I like to mess with guitar. I wanted to get that music done, so I've been focusing on that. I have other things that I'm doing, and also it's springtime, so there's a lot of stuff to do. And hopefully now I can get back to this, resolve this line of thought amongst others, and give you a good product, give you a good review, give you something that is useful to you, and hopefully helps you in your life. And I think that's what The Shining is all about. I think it's about a review of life, negatives in particular. And before I start off, I just want to point out there are numerous ways to learn. And we can learn by seeing how things should be done, and we can learn by seeing how things should not be done. And in a way, in my opinion, it's more valuable to see how they should not be done, because I feel there are many, many ways to do things right, but there are certain things that are really, really wrong. I guess you could say there are just as many ways of doing things wrong. I won't argue, but there are certain ways of doing things really wrong. And so I think if you kind of focus on those things, then it's a real good tool for learning. Now, spoiler alert, I'm talking about the book, I'm talking about the film, right? So if you want to read these things in concert with me and go through these in concert with the videos, then by all means, please do so. I do suggest that you read the book. You don't have to read Edgar Allan Poe. I did that for you in the previous episode. You can check that out on your own. And I suggest you watch the film. Kind of think about what you're looking at as you watch it. This is a micro-analysis of data, I guess you could say, that's contained within the book. And for that reason, it's unique. And if it's something that you enjoy, then please consider subscribing and giving a like. I appreciate that very much. Well, let's do a little bit of background again, real quick, okay? Now, I've said that this is the greatest American film ever made, so let's go through those criteria again, just as a kind of a refresher. Basically, 4 points. One, it needs to have layers of art and philosophy, history, symbolism, all these different things. If it can do that, then I consider it to be a complex work of art. The second is I want to have a lot of themes. I want to have coherent yet diverse themes. It should involve social, religious, political, familial themes. Third, it should incorporate pieces of the artists and the people that have made the work. So in the case of the film, that would be the producer, the director, the actors. In the case of the book, it would be pieces of Stephen King and the people around him. This is something that's very common amongst artists. And in my opinion, it is required to have soul, to have spirit. The data, the very small minutia, is what really gives something life. And it's not something that's easily faked. It's with generalities. It's something that needs to have very specific examples. And if those are included, you'll see it. And this is akin to Mr. Van Gogh's statement about seeing the soul of a painting by seeing the soul of the artist in the painting. Okay, and then the last thing is very important, which is that the work of art should have an effect or an impact on the viewer. For me, that can vary, but it should be something. For me, The Shining is pronounced. It's very similar to No Country for Old Men. It's something that you see, or at least I saw, and it disturbed me for a very long period of time. Consciously and subconsciously, it was kind of working its way through my brain. And so I think a really great work of art should do that to you. It should really kind of swallow you up like a whale. And you should have to deal with the totality of it over time. And if you do so over time, you'll be rewarded. I don't want to say you'll be rewarded with wisdom and understanding, but that's what I believe happens. I think you are rewarded in eventuality. If you struggle with these things and you don't give up, you're rewarded with wisdom and insight into the nature of the world and relationships and yourself. Okay? All right, so I guess that's pretty much it. That's kind of the intro that I wanted to give. So let's go ahead then and start, like I said, chapter 3. And I'm going to go through this point by point. Now, if I see something that is different between the book and the film, because it's in the book, then I'll thoroughly discuss it here. However, I will have a film discussion later that has things in it that are not at all in the book. As an example of this, I previously discussed the nature of the yellow bug in the film, and that's because in the book it's a red Volkswagen, it's not a yellow, so there's a difference there. Now there are things in the film that are totally new and are not in this book. I will discuss those when I get to the film. Does that make sense? Okay, so let's go ahead and get started then. The first is, and one last thing, I'll keep these in 1 hour blocks from now on. I've been struggling with the length of time required for these, and I've decided that's it. I'm going to do 1 hour blocks. It should be easily watched then. It should be easy to consume. It'll be 1 hour. It'll be easier for me to produce them and make them. And it'll be 1 hour, which is an easier amount of time for people to kind of digest the material as I run through it. Does that make sense? Hopefully it does. Okay, so let's continue on. And hopefully you're all caught up and you've watched the previous episodes. Okay, so the first is on page 16. There is a note that is in parentheses. It's very weirdly written. It's in parentheses and it says, it's basically asking Danny if he's okay. So we're seeing into the thoughts of Jack Torrance. Now at this time, he's being shown around the hotel by Mr. Watson. Mr. Watson does not directly correlate to the film. We have to assume that the man that's sitting with opposite of Jack Torrance when he's being interviewed, we assume that that is Watson, but I do not believe he's ever specifically identified in the film. However, the Watson in the book is kind of a blue-collar guy that talks rough, and he's showing all the work that needs to be done to Mr. Torrance as he's kind of showing him around the hotel. Okay, so at this time anyway, Jack Torrance's thoughts are kind of fleeting, and he's considering Danny. And so he thinks to himself, Danny, are you okay? Now, is this contact or is this just a memory of things going wrong? We'll find out perhaps a little bit later on. But I'm highlighting this for a reason. And the reason is because throughout this book, the relationship between Jack Torrance and Danny is significantly stronger than it is in the film. I'll get into this more as we go on, and I'll continue to reiterate this statement. But it is clear that Jack Torrance has a relationship with Danny. And in the film, it is clear that Danny has a closer relationship with his mother, not least of which this is shown because he starts off being around his mother, but also because he navigates the maze or the labyrinth later together with his mother, with his dad kind of looking on. It's an odd part of the film, but it indicates, of course, that Danny is closer to his mom in the film. In the book, not so. Is there a reason for that? Yes. Okay. Well, we'll get into that a little bit later on. Maybe. I don't know. Now, on that same page, towards the bottom, we find out that Danny is standing wearing nothing but his training pants. Okay, so now one of the more disturbing initial scenes of the film is clear. Why is Danny only wearing training pants when he's examined by the doctor? It's because it ties in with this specific story. And this specific story of Danny wearing only his training pants and wondering if Danny is okay is because Danny is injured by his own father for running around and making a mess and destroying his play, basically. So his father has been working on a play and everything is scattered around, and Jack kind of yanks him up by the arm and dislocates his arm or breaks it or something along those lines. Why was this not shown in the film? It's intimated in the film, as other things will be intimated. Why they were changed, it's difficult to know. But we now see why Danny is only wearing training pants when he's examined by the social worker or doctor, the lady's position in the beginning of the film. It's never clearly stated. Okay? So, that's the reason for that, and very likely it's pointing to this occasion in the book, indirectly. Let's look at the next note. On page 17, we find out that yes, the arm was broken, and this is not shown in the film. Okay, so there are various reasons why that might be the case. There are synthetic references, 2 or 3 things being tied together at once in the film, and I'll get into this a little bit later on. But the idea that the arm has been damaged, and by the way, this is a film of horror, but there are things that still can't be really shown on film, I suspect. So the idea of a parent physically abusing their own child in this fashion would be something that is, I believe, out of bounds. Just my opinion. It would be too terrible for most people to stomach. So even though the film is a rated R film, this is something that I think they can't show. I wouldn't want to see it, and hopefully you wouldn't want to either. So it's referenced in the film. How is it referenced? Okay, so we just talked about the training pants. Now we understand why when Danny goes to room 237 and comes out and he's sucking his thumb, his sweater is torn by the shoulder. It's a reference to this. That's why his sweater is torn at the shoulder. It's out of sync. It's not in line with the actual storyline of the book, but it can't be because of the nature of the story. And it's indirectly referenced. Okay? Now, other people such as Rob Ager and Collative Learning have already discussed this, that the room 237 is an indicator of abuse by the father upon Danny. And I will say here, it looks like the book is backing up what he's stating. The training pants, the Danny, are you okay? And then the injured arm are all kind of referenced here. And those are indirectly referenced in the film in the room 237. Okay? I do not always agree with Rob Ager and Collative Learning. And if you have not watched his videos, I suggest you do so. He's done a pretty good job. But generally speaking, he is well thought out. And I believe his videos are very good. Okay, so let's continue on. On page 18, we find out that one of the fears that Jack Torrance has is that his wife hates him and that she's going to want a divorce. Now, this is very important, okay? He mentions also that he knows the reason why is because he lost his temper and things went poorly. This fear of divorce is tied up within the numbers later, and I'll explain why. Okay? Page 18, we find out also that Jack Torrance is a drunk. He's an addict. In the middle of the page, that he's constantly craving for a drink, etc., especially when he's kind of spiraling into depression, etc. So this clearly states that he's a drunk, which is an agreement with the film. The next item I would like to discuss is on page 21. Okay, so he's talking with Watson. He's still kind of going through, and by the way, I mean he's learning all the work that he needs to do. But in the film, of course, Jack Torrance is not doing this work. Wendy is. So you have to begin to ask the question. There is the Wendy theory, and part of the Wendy theory is that something has gone on there. I won't get into it too much, but perhaps I will later. This is counter to Rob Ager because he does not believe that the Wendy theory is possible. I do believe that the Wendy theory is possible, and one of the arguments that can be made, at least in the film, is that Jack in the book is being shown all the work that he needs to do, but in the film that is not accomplished, and in fact the person that we see doing the work in the hotel is Wendy, which is a direct indicator that she's either in an extremely abusive relationship, which obviously is the case, and she has to do everything, or that she's the one that was intended to be the caretaker all along, or perhaps that Jack is already gone. And this is one of the aspects of the Wendy theory that, to me, is feasible, that Jack may already be gone. Part of the Wendy theory is that he's gone and has been frozen outside for a while. Okay, so anyway, on page 21, we find out that Watson, Jack Torrance is talking with him, and he says something along the lines of remarkably astute analysis, or something like that, are the words that Jack Torrance says to Watson, and Watson immediately kind of turns on him and questions his sexuality. The reason for this is he starts calling him a fairy boy that's kind of a college-level white-collar guy that's kind of, of questionable sexuality or questionable persuasion. Okay, so this is, again, not in the film. However, there is something that Rob Ager and Collative Learning have discussed, which is the viewing of the Playgirl magazine previous to Jack Torrance being interviewed for the job. So this questioning of a sexuality here is very close to the kind of ambiguous nature of Jack Torrance's sexuality. It's here in the book as well. It's just not done in the same way. It's done in a different way in the film. Okay, so let's move on to the next point that I would like to kind of point out to you. And that is on the bottom of page 21, we find out that the two girls in the film are not twins. We find out that they are in fact aged 8 and 6. Okay, now I really don't want to keep I don't want to keep hammering away at this idea, but I almost have to. The idea of twins, of course, is significant in the film because we already discussed the number 110. 110 rooms in the book and 110 employees. So that number was obviously chosen for a specific reason by Mr. King. Now, there are other reasons why a 1 and a 1 could be used. A 1 and a 1 obviously is a reflection. It also looks like two pillars, and it could be a reference to things like the Tree of Life. If you're familiar with Kabbalah, it could be a representation of that. The number 0 is a whole... you have to study these things if you want to try to understand what the numbers are that are possibly being used and referenced in those numbers. So 110 makes me suspicious already. Now, the two girls, if I'm correct now, the two girls of age 8 and 6 will be significant. Well, okay, so let's add up the numbers real quick. 8 and 6, 14. 1 and 4 makes 5. The number 5 has a very specific representation. Let's look at our book by J.E. Cirlot, A Dictionary of Symbols. We're going to look at numbers, and I'm going to break down these three numbers, 5, 6, and 8. Okay? So let's look at the numbers 5, 6, and 8. Now, first, I'm going to do the number 5, okay? Because you add these up, and you get the number 5. So, according to Cirlot, and I suggest everyone gets this book. It's a very, very good book, and I suggest you record and review your own dreams every day. If you want to confront the nature of your own, if you want to confront the nature of the difficulties of your own life and be in tune with your subconscious, in my opinion, just my opinion, and I'm just nobody, right? I'm not a certified psychologist or anything, but I believe that it is worthwhile for everyone to record their dreams and try to understand what their dreams are relaying to them. And I do believe that people have various types of dreams, and everyone is capable of having a spiritually significant dream. That's my opinion, okay? And you need to understand it when it's presented to you. And in order to understand it, you need to understand the symbolism behind your own dreams. And in order to do that, you should have this book. Okay? So let's look at the number 5. The number 5 is symbolic of man, health, and love. Represents 4 limbs of the body plus the head, which controls them. It can do the 4 fingers and the thumb. So it can represent the 5-pointed star, of course. It is also tied to organic nature, the golden section, 5 senses, 5 forms of matter. Okay, so we understand somewhat the nature of the number 5. But why are 6 and 8 chosen as the ages? Okay. Now, 8 is actually the easiest number, so let's start with that. It represents 2 squares or an octagon. It is an intermediate form between a square, which represents the earth, and a circle, which represents eternal order. So it's halfway in between the earth and eternal order, or this otherworldly idea. It is a symbol of regeneration. By signature of its shape, it's associated with 2 interlacing serpents of the caduceus. Okay, I don't know if you're familiar with the caduceus, the wand of Mercury, that's used in medicine, and represents balancing out of opposing forces or equivalence of spiritual power to natural. It can also represent eternally spiraling movement of the heavens. It was also used as the waters of baptism. Furthermore, it corresponds to medieval mystic companies of fixed stars, etc. The item that's most interesting or noteworthy there to me is the idea of eternity. The idea of eternity tied to the number 8. Okay, let's look at number 6. This is the most significant number of them all. The number 6 represents ambivalence and equilibrium. The union of 2 triangles, fire and water, or male and female. Of course, the upward pointed triangle is male and the downward pointed triangle is female. And therefore, it represents the human soul. Okay. It is a symbol of the hermaphrodite to the Greeks. And it represents 6 directions of space, 2 for each dimension, cessation of movement, etc. So we have a number of ideas there. And it appears that the 2 girls were murdered in The Shining for some strange reason. But the reason is somewhat stated here. And perhaps if we can understand the nature of those ages and those numbers, then we can understand the message behind kind of what's going on. Now, one of the thoughts that I have, and you can give me your ideas if you want, is that this is a house of sin. This is kind of a Gnostic idea. Perhaps it's a critique on the nature of the world or an unfit government. We'll get into that a little bit later. But the idea that there will be an eternity and fixed material form is a very karmic idea, because one of the things that people want to do when they want to exit the karmic cycle is to eventually leave permanently the material form. They want to become they want to be at union with whatever is a higher level creator, but that's blocked if you're constantly being forever reborn in material form. Yet being tied constantly to the material form is exactly what some people want. And so in this way, tied to the material form in the service of sins is captured in those numbers. Okay? So that's one interpretation. There are many other possible interpretations. Numbers can be positive or negative, depending upon context. That's why it's important to understand context. In my opinion, that is what is being relayed. That's why the girls are aged 6 and 8. Okay? Just my opinion. Let's get back to the book. On the next note I have is on page 22. On page 22, we find out there are a number of scandals here, and that there are some superstitions that are kind of going on. One is that there is no 13th floor and no mirrors on the back of doors. So now we kind of understand the nature of the mirrors. We already discussed the idea of mirrors. We've discussed how the beginning of the film shows what very likely is the river Styx with a reflection world on it, the realm of shadows and reflection versus the world above it, and the nature of superstition and reflection. So why are there no mirrors on doors? Obviously, so that things don't pass through the door. That's the superstition. Okay? The number 13 floor is obvious that there is negative connotation to the number 13 culturally. You can go research that if you like. I'm not going to get into that number. That's just a fairly common superstition that people have. Okay. So let's look at the next one. On page 23, we find out that the woman in room 217, now in the book the room is 217, is an old woman who apparently is a divorcee that was kind of living a good life and may or may not have chosen to take her own life with a bunch of sleeping pills, etc. And apparently she passed in the bathtub. Okay. So, her ghost of some sort is seen by a maid or a cleaning lady, and it kind of freaks her out. That story is relayed here by Watson, and now we kind of have a few other ideas to consider. Now, one of the things I want to point out is that in the book, he notes that her face, the passed away old lady's face, was all purple and puffy. Okay, so now we understand why the color purple is kind of a reference. So this room 237 in the film uses the colors pronouncedly of black, green, and purple. Those are the three main colors. There's a little bit of pink in it, if I remember correctly, but the three main colors are black, green, and purple. Now we have an explanation as to why those colors are there, not least of which is tied to Masque of the Red Death, but in this case, the woman is noted to be purple, puffy-faced, and she also is rich, wealthy, so the color green. And black representing, of course, death in this case, a return to the earth of the body, which is material. Okay, so what else is there to say about that? I guess we can go into the nature of 217. So there is our number there, and I guess I want to discuss that really quickly. The nature of the room 217. In my opinion, it's a better number than 237. Okay? I'll attempt to explain why. Now, as I mentioned, there are positive and negative numbers, or positive and negative definitions of numbers depending upon context. So let's consider the nature of 2 becoming 1 becoming 7. Okay? Now, normally we read from left to right, where we use Arabic numerals. 217. So what does the number 2 represent to most people? It represents interaction, but it also represents an interaction between male and female. We've already discussed there's a fear of divorce, and Danny also has this fear. We'll find out later. So the 2 becoming the number 1 could, of course, represent divorce. It also could represent a union. So 2 becoming 1 can represent a union. Well, what kind of union is it? 217. Now we see it's a union in service to something. 7. It becomes the number 7. As we mentioned, the number 7 is usually a positive number, but it can also be a markedly negative number if it represents the reflection of the virtues, in other words, the sins. If 2 becomes 1, if the wife and the husband become 1 in service of sin, it's doomed. And right there, in that number, 217, is captured the exact same ideas that we just covered in the numbers 6 and 8. Okay? Does that make sense? Now, the number 237, apparently the hotel that this that this is based on, or that they filmed at, didn't want to use the room 217 in the film. They were afraid that people wouldn't want to stay in that room. And apparently that's kind of exactly the opposite. Like, everyone asked to stay in room 237, although there wasn't one. I don't know. I mean, if I was running the hotel, I would just make a room 237 if people want to stay at it that much. But the number 237 kind of has a different connotation, I suppose. 217 really is perfect. It shows a complete understanding of the nature of numbers, and Mr. King has done so with 3 numbers now, or 3 pairs of numbers, I guess you could say. The 110 repeating, the number 6 and 8, and then here we have the process. Anytime I see a number that's 3 numbers, I think of a process. Past, present, future. 217, past, present, future. What's happening to this family? They were 2, they became 1, and they may, if they fail, become 7. Captured in this palace of sin, captured in the karmic cycle of repeat in the material form, and that may be what is being referenced here. Okay, that's why those numbers may exist. Now, there are people that believe that the room number 237 is chosen because it's a reference to roughly the distance in, I think, thousands of kilometers to the moon, and it has to do with the moon landing. I won't say that's wrong. It may be, but I favor my interpretation because I believe that the context overall is a context that has to do with illumination, understanding, and wisdom, and that ties in with the idea of numbers and all the lighting that's happening in the film. And of course, the reason it's in the film is because it's in the book, and it's in the book because it's in Edgar Allan Poe's short story, Masque of the Red Death. Okay, let's continue on. On page 27, this is chapter 4 now, we find out that indeed Danny is very afraid that his parents are going to get divorced. I don't know how much I want to get into this. I am the child of divorced parents, and I also was very afraid that my parents were going to get divorced. And my family had a lot of fighting. There was a lot of fighting. There was a lot of negativity happening at that point in time. But that doesn't change the fact that some people don't want to see the family split up, even though it might be broken. And the process in the long term might be better if there is a divorce. But it's hard to explain this to people that haven't gone through this. But there is a real fear tied to that, because it's unknown, but also because even though someone maybe is not really good for you, you're used to having them around. I don't know. It's a difficult emotion to explain to people that, like I said, that haven't had to go through that. And so we understand the nature of Danny's fear, that even though he obviously will be better off without his abusive father, he still has a fear of his mother and father being divorced. Okay, let's look at the next. And again, now that to me, that highlights the connection between the father and the son. Let's move on to the next point I'd like to make. That is that on page 28, there is aura reading going on. I guess Danny is reading auras. He sees his dad's thoughts and sees that they are black, that are kind of... that they are dark violet, and they have frightening veins of black. So here we see color being used. Why violet? I don't really know why that was chosen. I'm not really big into auras and that kind of stuff. Maybe someone else can throw in their suggestions. But for me, I don't really have a clear idea of why violet would be used there. Typically, purple and violet are kind of blue and red mixed, and so they encompass ideas of blue and red. And blue and red, again, like numbers, can be positive or negative. Why those are being chosen there, I don't know. It is, of course, curious that the color that's noted is violet, which is very similar in structure to the word violence. So maybe that's why it was chosen. I don't know. I wonder if that's why. Okay, let's move on to the next point that I would like to make. Let's see. Oh, I forgot something on page 23. The old lady that had passed, the ghost of the old lady, was mentioned to be grinning. And in the film, of course, she's laughing. She's laughing at Jack Torrance as he runs out of the room. And this idea of the laughing face of death is captured in numerous cultures. The mocking face of death is, it's of course on the face, the Gorgon face on the shield of Alexander the Great. It's this idea of fear of death and invoking fear of death in other people, overcoming that fear of death as a warrior, right? As a live person. Will we become paralyzed with the fear of death, or will we choose to be brave and work through and fight through that fear of death to live? And anyway, I don't know that all that's going on. I just find it a little bit interesting that he's chosen to make her kind of have this laughing face, which of course is kind of what happens with a face as it begins to decay. It begins to get morbid, and it's characterized by at least, well, there's two cultures right there I just mentioned that characterize it as a grin, kind of. Okay, so let's look at page 28. And on page 28 here, we find out that it's a doctor and not a psychologist or a social worker that is visiting with Danny. And now this is different now, but it's kind of a memory. But it's a different circumstance. And what has happened here is that the doctor has come to visit because Danny has had an epileptic fit, or he's passed out and experienced an epileptic fit with hallucinations, etc. Now he kind of, I guess he kind of describes this in a way. I don't know how much of it he goes into. I'm not exactly sure how much I want to say. But it is clear in the book that this is a doctor and not a social worker. So we've combined things now. The idea of passing out later in the book and having a doctor visit to discuss the nature of epilepsy, apparently, or visions, or whatever you want to call it. And the idea of the broken arm caused by his own father. And of course, in the film, this may or may not be combined into one scene when Danny is being reviewed in his training pants in his bed by a woman who's not identified, who, according to the book at least, is identified as a doctor. So we kind of would have to assume, I suppose, although it's not necessarily always a great idea to assume things, particularly with Mr. Kubrick, but we can assume, I think, relatively safely that is a doctor. However, to argue against that, when she mentions the broken arm, I don't know necessarily that there's much of a reaction from the doctor in the movie, which may be appropriate, I guess. If they were a social worker, they might have more of a reaction to it. I don't know. You decide. On page 29, we find out that the lost play that Jack Torrance has been working on is known to Danny. In other words, he knows where it is, and it's not because he has physically seen it. It's because he's been shown its location by his imaginary friend Tony, and has seen that in one of his visions. So he tells his father where it is because his father can't find it, and he finds it there. And of course, they're thinking he went down there and saw it, but they specifically state in the book that it's not possible that he could have gone down there to see it. Let's look at the next point that I'd kind of like to make a discussion about. And that is, again, on page 31, we find out that Danny has a connection to his father. He appears to be listening in to his father, thinking about the work that needs to be done with the shingles on the roof, etc. So again, he's connected to the father. Why is this important? Well, I'll try to get into that a little bit more later on in the discussion. But essentially, we have seen enough now through the numbers and through this discussion to see that what's being considered is cycles of birth and rebirth, etc. And so because cycles are considered, then we would have to recognize that what may be considered is the template of Jack Torrance being passed to his son. That's what the story kind of is about. Is the nature or the disease, is the damage done to the father going to be passed on to the son or not? And that's of course a danger, because they share a connection intrinsically. The father shares a connection to the son. The mother usually shares a connection to the daughter. Are the sins of the father going to be passed on to the son, or can that son break the cycle of that negativity? And if you've seen the film, you know that's probably what it's about. Okay, let's continue on. That's one angle anyway. Okay, so let's continue on. On page 31 also, we find out that in the vision, Danny is saying that there's snow everywhere and he can't really get to things. It's too hard to get to anything. It's too deep to get out. So this feeling of isolation is significant, because it is exactly the same feeling of isolation that is specifically discussed in the Masque of the Red Death, though it's explained in a different way. It's done with fortifications and weldments and all these other things. In The Shining, in the book, and in the film, the snow and the isolation of the landscape itself is what is creating isolation and danger. Okay? Let's continue on. On page 33 is my next note. It looks like we have here a reference to red rum and the bathtub. So Danny has another vision. In this case, it is of a hand with kind of a trickle of blood coming down one of the fingers. And in specific, it's the third finger. So now, the third finger typically is the ring finger, and this, of course, is a reference to marriage. So again, we have a reference to broken marriage or damaged marriage or bleeding marriage, and it's here in this vision as well. Assuming they're not counting the thumb as a finger, I don't know, people are kind of weird about this. They say either we have 4 fingers and a thumb, or they say we have 5 fingers. If it is just 5 fingers, it's the middle finger. Why that would be called out here, I don't know. I don't know why that would be the case. If you have ideas, I mean, hit me with your ideas. But if they're calling out fingers specifically, and the third finger, normally that's represented as the ring finger. And because this person in the bathtub is a divorcee, an old divorced woman, and the nature of the failure of her divorce appears to be the cause of her demise, which is exactly the same process that's going to kind of try to overtake Jack and Wendy Torrance, the demise of their marriage because of something, infidelity perhaps of the husband, or the nature of greed and riches. I don't know. They don't really get into why she's going through the process of divorce. But that certainly appears to be happening. And if that's the ring finger, then it would make sense. Okay, the next point that I would like to kind of point out is also on page 33, and that is that the color of the rug is noted to be black. So black and blue. So it's a blue rug with a bunch of blue shapes woven into it, etc. So this idea of black and blue rug, I don't really know. But of course, anytime you're dealing with black silhouettes or silhouette shapes, those can represent ghosts. So it's a little bit creepy to think that shapes of things and whatnot can represent ghosts, but perhaps that's why it's done. Now, I'll go through and I'll look real quick at the rugs in the film to see if any of them are this kind of black and blue. I don't know if that's going on or not, but if so, then perhaps we have a reason why it's that way now. And of course, Mr. King wrote this book after staying at a specific hotel. Who knows? Maybe some of the rugs there were black and blue. I don't know. Okay, the next point that I would kind of like to point out is also on page 33. And in this case, we find out the toxic nature of Jack Torrance. He's yelling at his son, "Take it like a man." Although Danny at this point doesn't recognize that he is the one that's kind of being chased, or who is chasing him. There's just someone kind of chasing him, telling him, "Take it like a man," and chasing him with this big hammer or mallet. And of course, a mallet is a phallic symbol, and it represents strength. So in this case, it would represent the superior male, the stronger male. There's a reason why the hammer, right, Maccabees in the Bible, is called that, and why it's representative of male power. Anyway, let's continue on. And again, it does have some sexual innuendo to it, and as we've noted with the discussion regarding homosexuality by Watson when he was showing around Jack Torrance, perhaps that's being included just to kind of throw people off. But I will remind you that in Stephen King's short story, he specifically states there was all kind of debauchery, is his term, not mine, debauchery happening in the in this fortress of the Duke. The nature of the term debauchery is open to interpretation. I'm not going to get into it too much. It's a really hard one to kind of deal with. I'll just say that debauchery is specifically noted. You can choose to identify whatever carnal processes you want to identify as being debauched. That's up to your interpretation, but perhaps that is why these references to sexuality are being made by Mr. King, because perhaps he's trying to continue that vein of thought, of debauchery that's called out by Mr. Edgar Allan Poe in his short story. Okay, let's continue on. And I'll also point out, of course, that the hammer and "take it like a man" also can be a representation of physical abuse, which, of course, men have done through time. Men have been exceptionally cruel to other men, physically, violently, and although men are more often physically violent as a general rule, the violence between men is significantly pronounced. So perhaps that's kind of, again, now we're discussing cycles, the handing down of an acceptance of violent behavior from father to son. Is that what's being discussed? I don't know. You decide, okay? Let's move on. The next point that I'll make is on page 33 as well, towards the bottom. We find out that there's a reference to Doc here. So right there's our first reference to Doc, and I'll kind of discuss that a little bit later on. I think that's the first reference to Doc. I'm not sure exactly where it is. But Danny's sitting on the curb, waiting for his father to come back, and he passes out. So he sees kind of a certain amount of visions, and then he kind of passes out. So the nature of that passing out, I won't get into too much. This is a kind of weird one for me because I have had episodes of passing out. I'm going to say about 10 of them during the course of my life. They started when I was a teenager, in my late teens. So I won't get into that too much. I'll just say that when Danny kind of gets up and he sees his dad. He kind of says, "Hi, Dad," and all this kind of stuff. But in my experience, it's not like that. When I have come back from wherever, and in some place, I'll tell you the last time that this happened to me. This is how I experienced it. I'm sure it's different for very many other people, but this is how I experienced it. Normally, it starts with pain somewhere. The last time it was in my back. It was a significant pain in my back, in my lower back. I laid down because normally I can tell when something's going wrong. So immediately I went to lay down. If anything like this happens to you, you know you should lay down. So I have a muscle tightening, and then usually my vision will start to go. And then that's it. That's the last thing I can remember. And when I woke up this time, of course, normally when I have woken up, I don't know where I am. I don't know who I am. I don't even know. I don't recognize shapes or faces or anything. I won't recognize people for a short period of time. I won't have any idea of names. One of the first times this happened to me was incredibly terrifying because it happened to me in a doctor when I woke up was looking in my face, and the face was completely alien to me. Not alien like an alien. It was alien like I didn't know what it was. I had to piece together what a face looked like, and I don't know how to explain that. Anyway, I don't want to discuss myself too much. That's not why I'm putting this together. I just want to explain it because they're discussing in this book. I don't know how much of this is common to how many other people. When I woke up, I recalled having a dream about being in the sea. I was deep in the sea, and as I woke up from it, I recalled that the idea of being loosely in the sea and then kind of collecting myself and coming back from the sea. That doesn't make any sense, but anyway, that was what I was seeing. So anyway, I made a song about it, and that's another reason why I haven't been making videos, because I like to play guitar. I like to mess with songs and make music. I made that song, the Iliad of Syd, or the Wine Deep Sea, I think I called it. I'll link it if you want to check out that song. Anyway, that's where that song came from. It was directly from that experience. And normally, by the way, there's a lead-in to that over the course of days. So I will start to feel strange for a number of days before I'm going to have a seizure. And it doesn't always happen. Sometimes I just don't feel very good and I just have to take it easy for a while and then I'm okay. But in this case, that was the last one. Anyway, so that was my experience with it. I have been offered to be given assistance by a doctor, and they kind of left it open to me. The main concern is safety, always. You need to make sure that you're safe. For me, personally, I have a pretty good idea of when things are going to happen. So I can kind of plan for those things to happen. If I couldn't, I would be very much more concerned about life in general. So if you're going through that, then I'm sorry that you have to go through that, and hopefully you can get some help for it. Mine are also very inconsistent. Like I said, it's been maybe 10 times, and luckily for me, they've gone away over time. So when I was late teens, early 20s, that's when I had maybe, I'm going to say, the vast majority. So like, I'm going to say like seven of the 10. And then since my late 20s to now, I've had maybe 3. And for a while, I thought they were completely gone until that last one about 4 years ago. Okay, so again, I'm sorry I'm talking about myself, and I shouldn't be. I just want to talk about the book and the film. Okay, so the last point I'll make from chapter 4, and then that'll be it for today, because we're almost at an hour. Let's see. This is page 34. Let's see what we've got. We have a reference to Doc, and he's saying, Danny, are you okay, Doc? And the father here, and very specifically, Jack tells his son that he loves him, and he brought him some stuff, and he asks him if he's big enough to carry it upstairs, and he calls his son Doc Torrance and says he's the strongest man, Anyway, Danny does see kind of visions, and he sees kind of a ghostly image of the mallet in the car, which ends up being like a rope mallet. But it's obvious that there is affection between the two of them, and that Jack Torrance does actually care about his son, that he's trying to do things correctly. And as we mentioned, Stephen King had hang-ups about the film, and he wanted to rework it. I think he's wrong. Personally, I think what Mr. Kubrick put together with his co-writer, is superior to the book. And I don't know that Mr. King agrees or understands, but I do believe that it is quite superior to the book. And I guess that's pretty much all I'll say. But that finalizes our connection between father and son. We'll get into that a little bit more later on. Hopefully you've enjoyed this discussion. It's going to be a while. I really didn't think it was going to be this long, and that's part of the reason for taking so long to put this video out, is because I actually had started to record stuff earlier, and it was running really long, and I wasn't enjoying doing it. But I think now I have a handle on how I'm going to do this. I'm just going to do it in hour-long episodes throughout the book, and then I'll do hour-long episodes throughout the movie, and then that'll be it. And hopefully you're reading along with me as I go through these, and if not, then I hope you can follow my chain of thought, and hopefully you've enjoyed this episode. So that's all for today. I'll talk with you folks later.